Hello and welcome to this True North interview. I'm Elie Cantin-Nantel. Today we will be discussing transgenderism, one of the most hot-button political and cultural topics of our time. Transgender activism and policy has been particularly controversial due to the impact that it has had on children, women, and free speech. Today I will be discussing the latter with transgender woman Julia Malott, who has been critical of gender ideology and modern-day trans activism. She has a blog website called A Lotta Thoughts, where she makes short videos expressing her thoughts on various issues that relate to transgenderism. And today I have the privilege of speaking with her. Before we get started, though, please drop a like on this video and consider subscribing to True North if you haven't already. Julia, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm quite excited for this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for inviting me.
So how about we get started with you telling us a bit about your journey as a transgender woman? At what age did you start experiencing gender dysphoria? And then when and why did you decide to transition? And how has that been for you?
So I would say, in a certain sense, I've always felt this way. And I say that with an asterisk, as I say most things, because when you're a kid, you don't know what you're feeling, right? I often think of some of the conversations I've had with friends who are gay, and it can take a while to kind of realize that, because you live in a society where the expectation, our norm is to be straight. And so there's kind of that assumption. And sometimes it can take quite a while to realize that there seems to be a conflict or something doesn't seem to be lining up that way. And for me, that was very much how this was. I felt these things very young. I didn't know what they were. I didn't have a word for them, and nobody talked about it. I'm a 90s baby. And so when I was in school, this was not a conversation. And people knew that something was going on. I saw 4 different counselors before grade 6 because Jason didn't have any friends. And no, I was Jason, by the way. And Jason didn't have any friends. And Jason didn't have, didn't connect with his classmates. And Jason had severe anxiety and all these things, but nobody was looking at it from an angle of identity. Nobody was looking at it at an angle from gender dysphoria, because that just wasn't that common in psychiatrics back in the 90s. For myself, I came to find the word transgender and transsexual when I was 12 years old. And I found that myself online, because I got to a point of desperation where I was old enough. I was starting to kind of understand what I was feeling and realize, like, oh, I really don't like being a boy. I'm really uncomfortable with the thought of developing to be a man. And I've always felt more like what I saw with the girls in my class and women aligned more with how I felt. And so I'm going to the internet, because that's all we had back then, because this wasn't in schools, this wasn't in the healthcare system. And I'm finding, very low grade blogs. This was not medical stuff, but I find people talking about it and I go, oh, there's other people who feel the way that I do. And I was always a very big science nerd. So once I did this, I thought, well, I want to find real information, because blogs are great, but that's just people speaking about their opinions. So I actually got high school biology textbooks, and I learned high school biology in grades 7 and 8, because in my, very egotistical child mind, I'm like, I want to figure out the answer. Why do I feel like this way? What's going on? And I guess I assumed that I would somehow get an answer that no one else had. No one had clearly asked this question, and Jason was going to be the first one. And then I went into the journal articles. So I don't know how much you followed a lot of the stuff around transgender matters, but a lot of the big researchers like Zucker and Bailey and Lawrence, they were people I was reading their articles as they were coming out as a teenager. But I was at the same time hiding all of this from my family, from my church, and from really all of my circles, because I attached an immense amount of shame to how I was feeling. And so I wasn't confronting it. I certainly wasn't telling anybody at this point, and I was not transitioning. But I was understanding how I felt and processing those feelings in a very unhealthy way.
And I guess, how has it been since transitioning? Do you feel like for you, this was the right decision?
That's such an interesting question. So to continue my story, I about 14, 15 years old, I kind of came to the decision for myself that I certainly wouldn't pursue a transition. I was uncomfortable with the thought of doing that. It was certainly not compatible with my faith or my family. And it was at that point that I kind of became extremely religious. I dove into my faith much more than I had in the past. I attended an evangelical Christian church. and actually worked in a church then for a number of years following that. And I got a girlfriend in grade 11, and I ended up marrying her. So we got married when we were 22, and she knew about this. We had talked about it when I was 18 years old, but it was one of those things that we kind of talked about and we just sort of left and ignored and didn't deal with. And our life didn't work. My life specifically didn't work. I wasn't happy. I wasn't thriving. And I was extremely narcissistic. And as I've gone through therapy since, and as I've kind of looked back, I attribute a lot of that to the shame that I was holding on myself. And that's why I have a hard time answering the question you just asked, in terms of I am much happier. I have a much more workable life now, and I'm thriving. But I have transitioned, and I have worked through the shame that I held around my dysphoria and not sharing it, not talking about it, not dealing with it and being open about it. And I think it would be dishonest of me to act as though I can separate those and I can know how much of the success and peace of mind I have now comes from the transition and how much of it comes from dealing with the shame. I'm sure they both contribute, and I can't say to what degree.
Right. And I guess this is where some, people are saying that, well, transition alone isn't the answer. There has to be other things as well, right? It's not just a black and white kind of one size fits all kind of super solution, right? So I think your story kind of alludes to that. Then why did you start your blog? I know you have a lot of thoughts and you discuss a lot of these issues from a really nuanced and I think a very common sense. And, you take a critical perspective on both the gender ideology, but also as to some of the other side that is critical of gender ideology, and you really kind of do an analysis, which, I really like. But what made you decide to do this? Because, it is, even as a transgender person, kind of a risk to go and challenge the narrative.
Yeah, it is. It is a risk in bad ways and in good ways. In bad ways, it's a risk because there's a very homogenous narrative on in the LGBT space and in progressive circles. And I haven't aligned with a lot of the progressive way of thinking ever, really. But it's easy to be given cover. It's easy to stay there and stay quiet, and people will assume that you align with certain beliefs. But speaking out as I've done has certainly created a wedge between those circles and myself, which is a risk, but has also opened up lots of really interesting and wonderful relationships with people of other, ways of thinking, which I value. Because for me, I don't posit to have the right answer. I think that we need to be able to ask the questions. And that, I guess, is one of the main reasons I started to speak up, is I realized we were hitting a point where we're not allowing the questions to be asked at all. I think the first video I did, so I do something called A Lot of Thoughts. I usually do these videos that are about 5 to 6 minutes long. Sometimes they're longer, depending on how much I have to say. But I explore topics around all of the stuff around gender identity and gender ideology in our schools and free speech and how all of these intersect. And I really got started on that as I was watching our school boards here in Ontario, and the number of people who were bringing concerns to school board meetings and were simply not allowed to talk. They were being shut down and told that their concern inherently was hateful or transphobic or in some other way a violation of the Ontario human rights. And that concerned me because that can exist, right? Like, there is a line that can be crossed where you can become hateful. And I have seen that happen too, but I was seeing more and more incidents where someone just has a concern. They say, I want to talk about washroom usage, or I want to talk about these books that I find concerning. And I don't believe that shutting that down is helpful, both because if we want to live in a liberal society, then we have to be able to have these conversations. And the idea about a book might be harmful is a great conversation to have, and we can talk about it and we can decide whether it is, but we don't have to shut it down. And also because I came to realize that the more militant those sorts of issues are being shut down, the more it comes back to bite people like me, because people end up blaming someone who's transgender for it. And I'm sitting here thinking, whoa, I think these are great conversations. Why are they being shut down? And so those are kind of the two things that came together and gave me the impetus to start speaking as I do.
Right. And you mentioned some of the topics that we're going to get into. I would argue that some of the pushback against transgenderism, kind of transgender activism rather, comes from the way that it's impacted three main areas: the way it's impacting children, the way it's impacting women and women's spaces, and in speech. And we're going to kind of go into these three things together. We'll start with children. I think it's the most relevant one, and you brought it up with the school boards. A big debate that's happening in both the United States and Canada and other parts of the world is, should children who, cannot drive or cannot buy alcohol, be able to medically transition or socially transition. So you told me a bit earlier that you, as a teenager, had gender dysphoria and you felt like something was wrong. So there's definitely a lot of young people that feel this gender dysphoria. What are your thoughts on the idea of transitioning children and teenagers?
Yeah, I think the pattern that we're going to see in this interview is I will not give you a straight answer on anything. And I think that's because of the nuance that interlaces all of these topics. So I am not at a place that I'm comfortable being unilaterally opposed to any and every childhood transition. And I think here we should clarify what we mean by childhood transition. Some people mean that socially, i.e. they have a name and a pronoun that they adopted in school and that's it. Some people mean that hormonally, they're going to go on some kind of a blocker like Lupron, or they're going to be going on to estradiol or testosterone. Or this could mean surgically. This could mean going to those steps of having a mastectomy or having reassignment surgeries with the genitals. And in all of those cases, I'm not comfortable drawing a line and saying never is that ever appropriate. But I'm certainly comfortable saying the process we're following right now is not working, because we've gone from a place of being very gatekeeping and very rigid on anything to do with transition for kids and adults, which is how it was probably up until the early 2000s. And when we realized that that was perhaps very restrictive and very problematic for people with deep dysphoria, we kind of swung entirely the other way. And now we've hit this place where even our medical system often can't ask the questions that are necessary, even for adults, to really vet and identify, is this the right measures for an individual to take? And that concerns me for adults too, not just children, but with children, there's the added element of their minors, of their brains are still developing. And I know that the system means well in this. They've looked at dysphoric cases like myself. I do believe I was probably a kid who would have benefited with a childhood transition, but I've also known lots of kids who want a childhood transition who, with what I know and with what I've seen and with all of the cases that I've worked with, I observe them and think, I'm not so sure that that's the right fix for you at all. You have a lot of other comorbidities that maybe should be tackled first. And so I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution. And that's where we've ended up right now, because we've made it into a human right to say everybody has the right to express gender and identity and expression as they see fit. And that's kind of trapped us into a corner in a certain way to say you can't question, you can't vet out if there's anything else going on under the hood, because that's deemed to be conversion, that's deemed to be non-affirming, when really I would posit that's just asking the questions that should always be asked. And I think that's where I do differ from the predominant LGBT narrative, that I don't think it's better to be trans. I think it is a very, caring thing that we allow people to do who have deep dysphoria like myself, because other mechanisms haven't worked. But if there's a kid and they could transition, or we can give them a fulfilled and prosperous life without transitioning, I believe we should always choose the non-transition path that has less, surgical risk, less hormonal risk. It's cheaper, it's less stigmatizing. I think that this is a path we go down when other options haven't worked. And we've shifted from that attitude to this place of you are the arbiter of your own fate. And if this is what you want, you should pursue it. But this is a one-way path in certain ways. I am post-surgical, so there's lots of things that I'm not getting back if I change my mind.
Right, for sure. And we're seeing a lot of older young adults that are now detransitioning, and they're saying, oh, this was not my problem, but because this ideology of gender affirmation, rather than, being like, let's see what is wrong with you. Is it gender dysphoria? It could be something else. And, if it is, in the end, gender dysphoria, then let's actually go and help you. We're just kind of saying if a kid is confused. And I do think that's a bit problematic. Kind of on the same topic, you brought up social transitions. And I know you've spoken out against this idea of hiding social transitions from parents when kids are socially transitioning at school. This is a debate that's going on right now in New Brunswick. So could you maybe explain why you don't agree with that? And I will ask you a question, I guess, from their side, is they claim that some homes aren't safe for trans people, and hence the kid needs to be protected from their parents. What would your answer be to that claim that's made by trans activists?
Yeah. So this is a topic that I've done a few videos on, just because it's been such a hot button issue in Canada and the States over the last 6 months. I've also delegated at a number of school boards in Ontario on this matter as well, and there's an interesting undertone in this discussion, because the part that I have a hard time reconciling is that first we're saying that identity is key, right? Identity is formative for an individual. We must affirm them, or else significant harms can come. And that's the reason why we are suggesting that very, very young children even need to have their identity affirmed, whatever that might be, because we don't want to cause harm. But then at the exact same time as this is happening, we're not telling the parents. So the background here is that many school districts, I know in Ontario it's every school board except for one, I don't know about all of the other provinces across Ontario, but many school boards will hide a social transition from parents if the kid doesn't want their parents to be told. So a kid can come to the teacher, they can say, I'm Jason, but I now want to be Julia, and I want to be called she, her. And the school has an explicit policy in place that will enable that transition. The teacher will get in front of the whole class and tell all the classmates that now Jason is Julia. All the other teachers will know, so that on the playground, Jason's not being called Julia. The principal knows. And they also know that if the parents call in and start talking about Jason, well, we don't tell them that Jason goes by Julia here. So it's taken a very active role in enabling this transition. And that's the piece that I have the most discomfort with. Kind of, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not here to comment on any particular kid and whether a social transition is right or not for them. I have my thoughts and I have my concerns with some of the cases I've seen, but that's not my role. However, I do think that the parents and the medical system must be involved in these decisions. And if the school enables it and is hiding it from the parents, then that clearly isn't happening. And so that's the piece that I have kind of most vocally spoken out against, is the importance of parental rights and parental involvement because of all the comorbidities and other factors that can be at play for that child.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that too, you have deceiving parents. It is wrong. But what if there is a case, for example, where there is a child who says, my parents at home are always railing against transgender people. They say they would rather, be dead than have a trans kid, for example. And this kid feels gender dysphoric and wants to be affirmed at school, but doesn't feel safe at home. I guess, what would you say would be the solution in a case like that?
Yeah, I guess I'd say three things. First thing I would say is, I know what it's like to be at school and to not want your parents to know what's going on, because I lived in a small town growing up. My dad was an elementary teacher and my mother was a high school teacher. So I spent my entire time at school with a parent in the building, which meant they didn't find out the stuff that parents normally found out about, the call home stuff, that Jason did something really bad and punched someone. They found out the tiny little details, like Jason didn't do one of the questions on his math homework last night. That would make it to my mom because she was a math teacher. And so I know what it's like to not want your parents to know things. And I also know what it's like to not want your parents to know that you have feelings surrounding transgender identities, because that was me. And I was devastated and dreaded the thought of my parents knowing. This was back in the 90s, but I kept a journal of a lot of my thoughts around this. And I kept it on an encrypted floppy drive that I had hidden in a place in my room. And my parents weren't even technical. But I did all these things because it's just in my head, the absolute worst thing that could happen that would rip my family apart was my parents discovering how I felt about my gender. And I didn't think that they would react well. And when I finally told them at 28, it wasn't good. There was a few years of tension in my family. But what service are we doing to any child by hiding this? Because one thing I know from transitioning is that once you start transitioning, you want it more. Once you decide to go by Julia and she, her, and you have a close circle of affirming friends who back you on that and support you in that identity, you resent everyone who calls you Jason even more. And so in that sense, we are going to push them away from their family at home. We're going to pull them closer into their teachers, into the educators, and into their classmates at school. And they're still stuck in that house for anywhere from, several to many, many years, depending on their age. And so I don't know where this is supposed to end in that respect. It's one thing, it'd be one thing if they were working with a counselor or a therapist at school and everyone agrees the parent has to know and you're not quite ready to tell them yet. Okay, so how are we going to get to that point? How are we going to work on this case? That would be one situation, but that's not what's happening. What's happening is just the medical side of it isn't our problem. We'll just do our part by calling you what you want to be called and hope all goes well as things form. That comes to my second point, which is we have and have always had a mechanism for handling abusive situations at home. In the analysis I've done on this and some of the speeches I've made, there are so many ways that I get notified about my daughter. She's in grade 11. when anything happens. I have to fill out a permission form for her to leave school property. I get called every time she is missing, is missing for a class. And yet I wouldn't know about this. What if my daughter's report card comes home and she does really poorly in her classes? Some families are abusive. Some families might, lash out physically or emotionally at their children for that. And that is horrible. But no one has suggested that we stop giving report cards to parents because they might not respond positively. How we've always handled it is if a teacher has a bona fide concern, they have real credible reason to believe that there's something wrong in a household, then they go to Children's Aid Services, because Children's Aid Services has the ability to come in and check out the household. They can have access to the house. They have access to the medical records. They can understand if there's a real concern or if there's not a real concern. I look at my case and say, my parents, I was scared to tell them, but they weren't abusive. If Children's Aid had been involved, they would have very clearly known that there was no credible concern other than my discomfort in telling my parents. But if a child comes to school and says, I feel that I want to go by she, her, and Julia, but I think my parents are going to hit me, then Children's Aid is the one who should solve that, because if you're going to be hit over that, maybe they're being hit over other things too. And this is why we have Children's Aid. And it just blows my mind that this is the one area that we've decided to circumvent that process that by and large works pretty well for identifying abusive households and supporting the household and resolving that.
Yeah, for sure. No, I totally would agree with you there that there are mechanisms in place. And, what's good with the New Brunswick law, and it actually has a few steps in place to how to deal with kids who aren't ready yet, to work with a counselor, to come up with a plan. Oftentimes kids just need a plan. And I think oftentimes, and this is not every time, but there's often times where kids are more scared of coming out than actually coming out. They realize once they come out, well, I didn't expect my parents to react so positively, right? There's often this fear of announcing a big news. Let's move on to the second area of controversy, which is the way that this is impacting women. I mean, you are a transgender woman yourself, so I feel like this is something that you may have a bit of lived experience on dealing with, or at least online. So a lot of feminists are saying, and that, and this is a view that I personally share about the sports, is that biological males should not be competing in competitive women's sports. And there's also people who say biological males don't belong in other women's spaces. They'll say like change rooms or dormitories or even bathrooms. They would argue somebody like yourself who looks and presents like a woman should go and use the man's washroom. What are your thoughts on the idea of female spaces, female sports? Where do we draw the line? You mentioned earlier about nuance. Where's the nuance in this, and what's acceptable and what is not according to you?
Yeah, some of these matters I have stronger opinions on than others. Some sports I have probably the weakest opinions on, simply because I'm not athletic. I like to rock climb. Rock climbing is lovely. Other than that, I have always shied away from sports. I'm not competitive. And so I don't even watch competitive sports. So it's a domain that I'm aware of from the transgender side of it because of the work I do, but I have very, very little skin in the game on either side in terms of where this lands. But I had a really inspired conversation with someone, I don't know, 3 or 4 months ago here. And I think we were talking about prisons that time. I forget, but we were talking about one of the hot button topics here. And she said to me that, so often we're ignoring that these institutions or these structures already had problems that weren't working. And rather than look at the root problem, now we've become really, really focused on the way that certain transgender matters perpetuate the problem, but we're still ignoring the root problem. And I love that in prisons, because the way we do prisons doesn't work. And I think a lot of us know that. Why does anybody ever get abused in prison? Why does anybody ever die in prison? Why does anybody ever get raped in prison? Like, I'm not okay with a biological male being in a woman's prison and causing abuse or rape, but I'm actually not okay with anybody being in prison and ended up being abused or raped, period. And when you look at the stats, I think it's 60% of the abuses and rapes in women's prisons are actually coming from the guards. So it's like, why is that happening? Like, clearly the system doesn't function the way that it needs to function, and we should fix that. Like, that would be an amazing thing to fix. And do I think that, someone who's biologically male who has been convicted of a sex crime should be in a women's prison? I don't think that. I think that's a bad idea. But I also think that just fixing that is going to leave so many other vulnerabilities still. So I try to look at these kind of very holistically and say, what in the system overall could be better? And on the sports thing, I look at the nuance and say, not all sports are the same thing. Some sports you benefit immensely from being taller, from being more muscular. Other sports like gymnastics, and sometimes it can be the opposite. And so it really depends on what sport are we looking at and what advantages do exist. And so I don't think that a one size fits all necessarily is appropriate. There's also questions of when did someone go on blockers, when did someone go on hormones. But I also empathize with the arguments that people are giving. It is upsetting when you see somebody who is 6'5" or 6'6" and has gone through male puberty and has big masculine muscles, be able to blow any biological woman out of the water, so to say, if this was a swimming competition. And that would bother me too, I think, if I was in that. So I don't think that it's something I'm comfortable just kind of going all in nothing on, but how's that for a non-answer? I'm practicing to be a politician. Can you tell?
Another issue that some feminists will point to is this change in language, and they say that this is erasing women. I mean, we've seen here in Canada, the governments use the term pregnant people rather than pregnant women, birthing persons instead of mothers. We say chest feeding instead of breastfeeding, and feminine hygiene has been replaced with menstrual hygiene. And I mean, I've even seen cases of tampons being put in, men's washrooms. What are your thoughts on this gender neutral language to refer to things that have traditionally been female only, like pregnancy, like menstruation? Do you think it's beneficial to use these gender neutral words, or do you think they're doing more harm than good right now?
You can probably see that I'm laughing right now as you're saying this. I don't know how to not laugh at all of that stuff. It's a few months ago, research. Sorry, what was that?
I said me neither.
Yeah, like a few months ago, a researcher from Australia reached out to me. Her name was Caroline Gribble, and she did a paper on this. And she asked if I would read her paper and provide my thoughts. And it was a great paper. And she discussed basically every word you mentioned there, along with many others. And I think there's more than one debate going on with language. We could do many hour-long discussions about language, but a lot of the ones that you zeroed in on there and what you just described are the ones that originate from queer theory. And that's the piece that I am not in alignment with. So the queer theory attitude, the postmodern deconstructivism that comes in from that, and I won't get into the theory too much, but that's where we get the idea of deconstructing sex and gender, of ripping them apart and saying sex is biology and gender is this conceptualization that can be whatever we want it to be, right? So you might say there's men and women as genders, but I can say that there's 3 or 5 per million, and that's fine. And we can all have our own gender. And that's what leads to a lot of the language changes. I think that's very silly myself, because I'm gender dysphoric, because I'm biologically male. I was born with a penis and with everything that boys have. And I had extreme emotional discomfort with that. In a sense, I had a disability, right? Because I wasn't able to thrive for emotional reasons because of that. And so I have made physical changes hormonally and surgically in order to try to cope with that, in order to align as closely as I can with the biological sex that I am not. So in other words, I deeply affirm the idea of there being this dichotomy of, male and femaleness, and I'm trying to be as close to female as I can, knowing that I will never actually be female. So for me, all of the language changes seem very, very silly. Women menstruate. That's what women do. Do I menstruate? I do not menstruate. But that's okay. We don't have to change the language around it, because that's what they do. And the same going the other way. Women, breastfeed. Well, the fact that someone has decided to be on testosterone doesn't mean that they don't still have mammary glands and have the ability to breastfeed. I don't know why we have to change the language around it, though. I don't think that helps anybody. I think it gets confusing and complicated and upsets people when they feel their gender, their sex being ripped apart and kind of be told that they're separate in ways that doesn't resonate with them.
Right. And I would agree with you there. I think that that's very well said. And you did touch on queer theory. And I think this leads actually pretty well into my next question. Queer theory and gender ideology have really been behind the whole pronouns thing, this notion that people have different pronouns that are maybe not he, him, or she, her. You made a video a series of videos where you talked about the issues with fixating on pronouns, and you said it's bad for transgender people. So can you maybe explain your thoughts on that and why you don't think we should be compelling people to use pronouns as is being done right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So early on in my transition journey, I think I mentioned I started around 28. And like most people, I started very privately. Some of my close friends knew, and I was still Jason at work, and I was still Jason out in public. And then I was being called Julia and she, her in this little circle. And like I already referenced when talking about kids, that felt really good. I liked it. I'm like, oh, I feel so warm and fuzzy with these people. Oh, I don't like what I'm getting everywhere else. But then as I went in and started to expand my transition socially, I'd run into people who maybe wanted to affirm me. They wanted to call me what I wanted to be called, but then they would, mess up, so to say, or they'd say he, him, because, I'm 5'10", or my voice is fairly low, or they knew me as Jason for 28 years. All these, reasons that came out. And these are not people who are trying in any way to get to me. These are people who like me and affirm me, but we mess up. It's hard, right? I get it. It's hard. And that really upset me. Like when that would happen, it wasn't just I didn't like it. It might throw me into a cycle for a few days where I'd be, emotionally thrown off. And I wouldn't want to, go and see that person anymore, or chat with that person because I was uncomfortable with them. And I had an amazing life coach at this point in time. And as I really kind of wrestled with him and so what was going on, I came to realize that was because I was denying reality. I wanted to be female. And at this point, I was imagining that I was. I had created this facade. I am female just like all the other women. And, if you don't call me that, when you call me he, him, it reminded me that you saw something different. You might like me. You might like me and want to hang out with me and be totally fine with my transition, but something registered different for you. And you saw that. And just knowing that you saw that was what would tear me apart. And when I realized that, I realized how easy it was to just construct this differently for myself and say, I am biologically male and people are going to see that. And that doesn't mean that they dislike me. That just means that they see that. And thus, I don't need to be bothered by that. And so that was kind of the first transition that I made for myself, was to understand that it wasn't helpful to me to not, to kind of, separate myself from reality, because it creates ways when I can get hurt by other people in their language. Then as I started to read a lot more authors in this space and get involved in the work I'm doing now, I was also concerned about the whole idea of compelled speech and the risks that come along with that. For myself, I unapologetically will use the pronouns that people want me to use for them because I understand how that can feel good. I understand how that can be helpful. And mostly I want to respect people. I don't know what your legal name is. I haven't seen your ID and I don't need to. I know what you want me to call you. And so I'm going to call you that. And for me, pronouns kind of align the same way. But that doesn't mean I'm comfortable mandating it for somebody else. It's not illegal to be a jerk. It's just maybe not going to make you a lot of friends. And so if somebody insists that they want to call me he, him, they know I don't really want that. Okay, well, whatever, right? Like I'd rather have a conversation with them than get really upset over someone who's intentionally trying to do something that they suspect I won't like. And of course, what I found is that taking that position means I basically never get he, him, because people, for the most part, aren't jerks, right? Even people in this gender critical space, they're concerned about being compelled. And when I come along and say, look, what you feel and what you want matters too, let's just do what you're comfortable with. Almost always people call me she, her because they don't feel like they're denying reality. It's just being decent to someone and calling them what they want to be called.
Another part of the criticism from the transgender activism is this idea that they censor people by shutting down their views, and they'll show up and protest. And there's other protest movements that take part in these tactics. BLM has, some indigenous rights protests have, some socialist protests have. But I don't think there's a group that does it as viciously and as strongly as the queer and trans activists when it comes to, trying to cancel people. I mean, the way they treated J.K. Rowling, the way they treated Helen Joyce, for example. Why do you think a lot of these people seem to be so angry, so upset, and feel such a need to shut down anyone that's critical of them? Because to me, that sounds almost like there's a psychological aspect to this.
So I agree and I disagree with you there. I agree that everything you described in terms of the behavior that you see with shutting things down from many trans rights activists. There's another group, though, who I've seen be just as vitriolic in terms of how they handle their activism as well. And that's the radical feminists. And I want to be clear here that I'm not using radical feminism and gender critical as analogous terms. Gender critical has, in some circles, come to be, a politically correct way to refer to someone who might have been called a TERF previously, or a trans exclusionary radical feminist. But it's also used more broadly as anybody who's critical of, the ideological approach to gender that's being taken under queer theory. And that's the one I'm using here. So we have this realm of gender critical people who have concerns. I think you probably consider yourself gender critical. I'd consider myself gender critical. And then we have the radical feminists who align very much with, the radical feminist ideologies that originated in the 70s. And for lack of a better term, it is a woke ideology. It is a woke ideology the same way that queer theory is a woke ideology, the same way that anti-racism is a woke ideology. They're all rooting from the same place of critical social justice. And it creates that really strong activist shutting down drive that you see. And so I do see that with the trans activists, and I receive it because I'm on the enemy side to them because, I don't align with their narrative. So I receive that from them. But I receive the exact same thing from the radical feminists as well in the exact same way. And I've noticed those two particular parties, it's an intensity I don't get from, say, a classical conservative who might have conservative values, but they don't have the vitriol. They might not agree with me, but it's not so vile the same way. And I think that's why you see such tension between trans rights activisms and radical feminists, because they're both using the same ideology. And this is possibly the first circumstance under critical social justice where we've seen two woke ideologies pitted against each other. Often is something like, as you mentioned, it's, anti-racism and queer theory, which you could be both, right? You can be an anti-racist and a queer theory advocate, or you may not, but they're not diametrically opposed. But radical feminism and trans rights activism have found themselves in diametrically opposed positions. Their enemy is each other. And it's very scary. It's very scary. So I'm sitting here in the middle and hoping they mostly shoot over me, and occasionally I get some crossfire.
Right. And it is something that is important to notice, some of the vitriol. And I look at some of the comments you've gotten from people that are more gender critical, or I look at some of the abuse that Caitlyn Jenner has gotten from the right, even though she is taking such brave stances on, let's say, women's sports and whatnot, or even Blair White, who's one of my favorite transgender commentator. I've seen a lot of people recently refer to her as he and saying that he's just a mentally ill dude. And they're saying that we should always misgender transgender people. We should ban transgenderism and eradicate it from society, as Michael Knowles said at CPAC, and that they're just delusional people that, are unfit for higher office, as they said with Caitlyn Jenner when she ran for governor. In a fight to, let's say, safeguard gender transition for kids, or protect women's spaces, or to protect free speech, what do you think that type of rhetoric has on a movement that wants these basic principles done?
Yeah, I think the effect is deleterious. And that is the other reason why I'm here doing what I'm doing. Because I mentioned earlier how I would watch in our school board meetings how many concerned parents are being shut down simply for raising a concern, because the narrative has to become call anybody hateful and transphobic simply for having a concern. And my perspective is there is hate out there. There is a concern. And instead, we are targeting all these people who don't have hate and who are just asking questions. And I want to be in that space, in the gender critical realm, to draw a very, very clear wedge and say, look, there's all of these people who have valid concerns and valid questions about sports, washrooms, prisons, children, transition, all these things that we can and should discuss. And there's all these people over here who actually are hateful, who actually have fascist views, who really we should be concerned about. And they're different groups, but they blend together so easily, right? Before someone like me is in a space, oh, you have a concern about washrooms, you have a concern about washrooms. Great, we're friends. And you don't always necessarily realize someone else's motivation. And as I've found, when I come into a space, a private group or a conference, or it's just a friendship circle, it tends to make it pretty clear all of a sudden, because some people are like, Julia's amazing. Julia says what we're saying. Julia helps us move these things forward. And other people say, absolutely not. Julia is, the embodiment of everything we hate. And it makes it clear whether you hate and have contempt and disdain for transgender people, or whether you have concerns about issues. And so for me, we need to separate those two kind of sects of people. And that's one of my objectives.
Right, for sure. I would agree there. So we're obviously not done having these discussions, these debates. I mean, I think the transgender debate in Canada has really been around since Justin Trudeau has been elected. There was Bill C-16 with Jordan Peterson. There was the sex ed debate in Ontario. Now we're seeing the debates around sports, around prisons, around children. And I think it's only going to keep going from here. Where do you think this narrative, these dialogues are going to go? And then is it where you think you want it to go? Or do you think we're due for more, I guess, polarization and more extreme kind of agenda demands and whatnot?
I'm certainly not smart enough to be able to comment on where I think this goes. I don't like the way it is going. I'll say that much. I don't like the division. I think that the polarization is very scary. And that's why my mission is to bridge to the gap, is to say, we need to be able to talk. We need to be able to connect. I travel mostly in gender critical circles now, and every day I'm meeting people who have never known a transgender person. They know of transgender people. They know of those angry people that they've seen in, viral posts where they're called perverts and all these things, but they don't know someone, and they certainly have not encountered someone they can like. And that has been my goal. It has to be in those gender critical circles and those conservative circles, and be a transgender person whom they can like as a person. That doesn't mean they have to agree with me. And I'm not looking for anyone to agree with me. I avoid debates like the plague. I'm not looking to go into a debate and argue with someone over whether something is right or not. I'm looking to humanize transgender people, to prevent that extremism from forming, and to say, look, there are people who are gender dysphoric. There are people who are caught in the crossfire here. You can totally be against policies and ideologies. Like, I'll help you in some cases where we're aligned, but let's not make it about the people, and let's not get to a point where people on either side are being hurt. And I'm in Waterloo region here, and a few weeks ago we had exactly that happen, and that's scary. That's scary stuff, because I don't ever want to see policy disagreements move to a point where people are actually being, encountering violence.
No, for sure. That's a good point. I do think we have to, on all sides, really tone the temperature down and stop these accusations that concerned parents are genocidal, transphobe, and that all transgender people are groomers, for example. I really don't think that sort of dialogue. So I can understand the frustration people have. Absolutely. A lot of what's going on is very frustrating, but I think as human beings, we need to acknowledge that we're often emotional and try to kind of take a breath and find what's common sense, what are we going to fight, and remember what we're fighting against. And I think for a lot of people, they're not actually fighting against transgender people. They're fighting against gender ideology, and that being imposed on their children, on their sports, on their charter rights, such as free speech. They're not actually against transgender people. And I think sometimes people need to, take a breather and remind themselves of that. Well, Julia, thank you so much for joining me. I think this was a really good conversation, a productive conversation. I certainly learned a lot, and I wish you the best of luck. Please continue to speak out. I think it's good for Ontario and Canada to have voices like you that are critical of narratives and think for yourself with nuance. So thanks again for coming on today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
I hope that you enjoyed this discussion. I sure did. Please consider supporting True North by visiting donate.tnc.news. For True North, I'm Cantin-Nantel. Thank you for watching.